Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about three girls who vanished at a river in 1993 and the one who returned 31 years later, bound by silence. It's a mystery you might have never heard before, buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The call came on a Tuesday night in July 2024, shattering the sterile, ordered silence of a Silicon Valley home. Outside, the world hummed with the predictable rhythm of automated sprinklers and distant traffic. Inside, Sarah Chen Kim, a woman who had spent 3 decades building a fortress of normalcy around a core of unspeakable trauma, sat reading. The life she had constructed was one of precision, of solvable equations and predictable outcomes, a world away from the humid, uncertain summers of her youth. Then, the phone rang. It was not a number she recognized, an anomaly in a life curated to avoid them. A hesitation, a deep breath, and she answered. For a moment, there was only static, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound of distance, of years. Then, a voice, thin and hoarse, a ghost of a voice she had replayed in her nightmares for half a lifetime, crawled through the receiver. Sarah, the name, her name, sounded alien in that fragile timbre. "It's me. It's Amanda." The book fell from Sarah's hands. The world tilted on its axis. 31 years. 31 years of memorials without bodies, of grief without closure, of a story told to police so many times it had lost its meaning. 31 years. And now, a voice from the grave. Questions, a tidal wave of them, crashed against the inside of her skull, but she could not force a single one past her lips. It was Amanda who spoke again, her words measured, as if each one was a heavy stone she had to lift. "I'm at a gas station outside Cedar Falls." The voice rasped, each word laced with an exhaustion that time alone could not explain. Sarah's mind reeled. Cedar Falls, the place she had fled, the place she had never returned to. The voice continued, preempting the most urgent, the most desperate question of all. Kelly isn't coming home." A pause, thick with unsaid horrors. "But she saved us both in the end. She saved us both." The line went dead. Sarah was left clutching a silent phone, the carefully constructed reality of her life in ruins around her. Amanda was alive. Kelly was not. And between those two terrible truths lay a chasm of 31 years, filled with a secret so monstrous it could only be protected by silence. To understand that silence, to even begin to comprehend the sacrifice it held, we must travel back across 3 decades, to a summer drowning in heat and innocence, a summer when the fate of 3 young women was about to be sealed by the deep, dark waters of a river and the watchful, patient evil that lurked in the endless fields of Iowa. The summer of 1993 in Cedar Falls, Iowa, felt different from the start. It was a place built on a foundation of deceptive tranquility, a quintessential slice of the American heartland where life moved with the slow, deliberate pace of the seasons. The corn stood higher than usual in the endless fields that stretched beyond the town's limits, forming a verdant labyrinth that kept secrets as well as it kept boundaries. The humidity hung thick as molasses over the weathered farmhouses and tree-lined streets, a syrupy presence that seemed to slow time and muffle sound, creating an atmosphere of profound isolation. This was a world where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. They knew whose farm was failing, whose son was drinking too much, whose marriage was fraying at the edges. But they did not know about the darkness that could fester just beyond the edge of town, hidden in plain sight. The social landscape of Cedar Falls was governed by unspoken rules, a quiet hierarchy of old families and newcomers. It was a world that prized conformity. And for those who were different, it could be a lonely place. This was the backdrop against which the inseparable friendship of Sarah Chen, Amanda Rodriguez, and Kelly Thompson was forged. Their bond was a sanctuary, a nation of three carved out of the overwhelming homogeneity of their surroundings. Sarah's family had moved from San Francisco for her father's engineering job at John Deere, trading the vibrant diversity of the coast for the stark, quiet beauty of the Midwest. She was often the only Asian American face in her classes, a quiet observer navigating a world that was not built for her. Amanda's family had immigrated from Mexico, carrying with them the heavy hopes and sacrifices of a new life. They lived with the constant, quiet pressure to succeed, to validate the dreams their parents had deferred. And Kelly, though she came from one of the town's oldest families, possessed an innate sympathy for the underdog, a restless spirit that chafed against the town's provincialism. Her ambition to be a journalist was more than a career choice. It was a declaration of intent to look beneath the placid surface of things. Their chosen escape was often the Shell Rock River, a winding ribbon of water that cut through the farmland. To most, it was a place for wholesome family picnics and lazy summer afternoons. But local lore painted a more complex picture. It was also a place of whispered warnings, a repository of stories about teenage drinking parties that ended in tragedy, of currents that could pull a swimmer under without a sound. The river, like the town itself, had two faces, one sunny and inviting, the other dark and treacherous. It gave freely of its beauty, but also kept its own ledger of secrets, a silent witness to the moments of joy and terror that unfolded along its banks. It was here, in this place of dualities, that the three friends would seek a final day of innocent freedom before their adult lives began. They had no way of knowing the river was waiting, and that it would demand a sacrifice none of them could ever have imagined. At the heart of this seemingly placid world were three distinct souls, each carrying a trait that would prove fatalistically significant on that July day. Sarah Chen was the trio's quiet anchor, possessing a sensitivity that bordered on prescience. She often felt the emotional currents of a room before a single word was spoken. It was not a magical ability, but a deep, intuitive empathy, a quiet alarm system that hummed constantly beneath the surface of her thoughts. She saw the weight of expectation in Amanda's eyes and the fierce, hungry ambition burning behind Kelly's confident smile. She was the observer, the one who worried, the one who felt the first subtle shift in the atmosphere when danger was near. Amanda Rodriguez was the historian of their friendship, the designated documentarian. Her disposable camera was a constant companion, not out of vanity, but out of profound fear of transience. Having moved frequently as a child, she understood that moments were fleeting, that happiness could dissolve like sugar on the tongue. Her desire to capture everything, the way the light filtered through the trees, the exact shade of a wildflower, the shared, secret smiles between friends was a desperate attempt to create permanence, to build a tangible archive of joy that could be revisited when memory began to fade. This need to document, to possess a record of the truth would become a tragic and terrible irony. And then there was Kelly Thompson. If Sarah was the anchor and Amanda the historian, Kelly was the explorer, the seeker of truths. The void left by her absent father had been filled with a relentless drive to uncover the secrets of others. Her job at the local newspaper was not just a summer gig. It was the first step in a crusade. She believed in the clarifying power of facts, in the journalist's duty to drag darkness into the light. Her curiosity was a brilliant, blazing fire, a force of nature that propelled the group forward. It was this very quality, this insatiable need to know what lay around the next bend, that would steer their collective fate directly into the heart of an unimaginable abyss. On the morning of July 15th, as they drove toward the river with the windows down and the radio blasting, a sense of perfect, crystalline freedom enveloped them. But as they ventured further upstream that afternoon, away from the familiar laughter of families and into a stretch of woods that seemed unnaturally quiet, Sarah's internal alarm began to sound. A profound and inexplicable chill washed over her, raising goosebumps on her sun-warmed skin. It was a premonition she couldn't name, a sudden, suffocating feeling that the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. She looked at the path ahead, where the trees grew thicker, their branches weaving a canopy so dense it seemed to swallow the daylight. Something was wrong. The feeling was as real and as solid as the ground beneath her feet. But to voice it would be to break the spell of their perfect day, to disappoint the two people who made her feel like she belonged. And so, overriding the primal scream in her own soul, she followed her friends, taking the last steps of her innocent life. The path they followed was no longer a path at all, but a barely discernible trail of flattened grass and displaced stones that suggested infrequent passage. The character of the shelled rock river transformed here, shedding its lazy, sun-dappled demeanor. The water ran deeper, its voice a more urgent murmur as it carved through the land with a purpose they hadn't sensed before. The trees grew closer to the water's edge, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense cathedral-like canopy that plunged the temperature into a cool, damp twilight. Wildflowers still dotted the banks, black-eyed Susans and purple cornflowers, but even their cheerful colors seemed subdued in the encroaching gloom. Amanda paused to photograph them, her camera's small click sounding unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. A futile attempt to impose order on a landscape that felt increasingly untamed and hostile. Kelly forged ahead, her journalistic instincts now fully ignited by the thrill of the unknown. She moved with the unthinking confidence of someone who had only ever read about true danger, a person for whom curiosity was a virtue that was always rewarded. To her, this was the beginning of an adventure, a story they would tell for years to come. Amanda followed, her artist's eye capturing the haunting play of light through the leaves, the stark geometry of fallen logs. But Sarah, bringing up the rear, fought a rising tide of panic. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. The sound of their own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the dense vegetation, as if the forest was actively swallowing the evidence of their passage. The air itself felt thick and watchful, ancient and indifferent to their youthful intrusion. It was a place that did not want them there. They had been walking for perhaps 15 minutes, a time frame that felt both fleeting and eternal, when Amanda spotted it first, through a thicket of overgrown sumac, some 50 yards ahead. Stood a structure. At first glance, it appeared to be a maintenance shed or a forgotten utility building related to the state park. But as they drew closer, its true nature revealed itself. This was not a place of function. It was a place of profound decay. The building was a wound on the landscape, a skeletal ruin of weathered wood that sagged under the weight of its own slow collapse. The roof dipped precariously in the middle, burdened by a generation of fallen branches. One wall leaned inward, as if tired of standing. Whatever paint had once covered the splintered planks had long since been scoured away by sun and ice, leaving the surfaces a ghostly, corpse-like gray. "What do you think it is?" Kelly's voice was a hushed whisper of excitement, her camera already raised. The reporter in her had taken over, her mind alight with the narrative possibilities of their discovery. Amanda, however, was more hesitant, her steps slowing as the full desolation of the structure became apparent. "It looks like it's been empty for years," she observed, her gaze fixed on the waist-high weeds choking the foundation and the saplings sprouting defiantly from gaps in the roof. "Maybe an old fishing cabin." Sarah said nothing. Her earlier, formless premonition had now crystallized into a cold, sharp-edged certainty of dread. Everything about the building felt wrong. Its isolation was absolute. Its decay was malignant. And most unsettling of all was the way it seemed to have been utterly forgotten by the world while remaining strangely, unnervingly intact. She wanted to plead with them, to insist they take a few photos from this safe distance and then head back to the familiar comfort of their quilt and the remnants of their picnic. But Kelly was already at the cabin's single door. It hung slightly ajar, a dark vertical slash against the grey wood, revealing nothing but an impenetrable blackness beyond the threshold, with the journalist's impulsive resolve. Kelly pushed it open with her foot. The rusty hinges screamed in protest, a long metallic shriek that echoed through the silent woods like a dire warning for a heart-stopping moment. The three girls stood frozen on the threshold between the sunlit world they knew and the profound darkness that waited inside. The interior of the cabin was a physical assault on the senses. The air was the first violation, thick and stagnant with the smell of mildew, wet rot, and something else, something organic, cloying, and deeply unpleasant that made Sarah's stomach clench. It was a smell that hinted at things left to decay in darkness for a very, very long time. The dim light filtering through the grimy, boarded-up windows revealed a single, squalid room. The furniture they had glimpsed from outside was a collection of derelict objects that seemed to have been scavenged rather than chosen. A crude wooden table stained with dark, almost black, marks of unknown origin, several canvas camp chairs, their fabric torn and discolored, and rusted fishing equipment that looked more like archaeological artifacts than functional tools. It was a scene of simple, unremarkable squalor. But it was the personal items, the things that did not belong, that transformed the atmosphere from merely unsettling to one of pure, undiluted horror. In the corners of the room, arranged in unnervingly neat piles, was clothing, women's clothing, girls' clothing, sundresses and denim shorts, blouses and t-shirts, intimate apparel garments that spoke of summer days and youthful lives, now lying in meticulously sorted stacks like offerings at a profane altar. On the dusty windowsill, jewelry was displayed like a grotesque collection of trophies, mostly cheap costume pieces, plastic bangles, and tarnished chains, but among them were items that made Amanda's breath catch in her throat: a silver locket, a delicate charm bracelet, and what appeared to be a high school class ring from a nearby town, its stone glinting dully in the gloom. Each item was a sultan testament, a ghost of a life interrupted. Each piece told a story, and together they screamed of a multitude of victims. But the final, soul-shattering revelation was on the walls. Every available surface was covered with photographs, dozens upon dozens of them, tacked to the splintered wood in a chaotic, overlapping collage. They were images of women and girls, of all ages, all captured from a distance, all completely unaware they were being watched. Some pictures showed subjects at this very river, laughing and splashing in the shallows. Others appeared to have been taken in town, through shop windows, or even, chillingly, through the windows of their own homes. The clothing styles and the faded, grainy quality of the images suggested the collection spanned decades. It was a life's work, the life's work of a predator. The wall was a gallery of stolen souls, a visual record of a secret, obsessive evil that had operated, undetected, in their quiet corner of the world for longer than they had been alive. Amanda had gone completely pale, her hand clutching her own camera to her chest as if to protect it from the malevolent energy in the room. Kelly, however, seemed momentarily transfixed, her journalistic training battling her rising terror. Her own camera came up, almost by instinct, the flash firing once, twice, creating stark, monstrous shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the oppressive atmosphere. "We have to call the police," Kelly murmured back, her voice shaking but resolute as she continued to document the horror. "This is evidence. Someone needs to." She never finished the sentence. Her words were cut short by a sound from outside, a sound that did not belong to the forest. A soft, deliberate creak of a wooden floorboard on the porch. All three girls froze, their blood turning to ice, their eyes locked on the partially open door. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird, so loud she was certain whoever was outside could hear it. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and heavy, the old porch groaning under the weight of the unseen visitor. Then, the footsteps stopped, directly in front of the door. An eternal silence descended, broken only by the sound of three teenage girls trying not to breathe. At that exact moment, the storm clouds that had been gathering all afternoon chose to break. The sky opened up, and a torrential downpour began drumming against the cabin's corrugated metal roof with the sudden, violent roar of machine gun fire. The noise was both a blessing and a curse. It would mask any sound they made, but it also sealed their fate, trapping them in this horrifying place until the storm passed. And then, through the deafening noise of the rain, they saw it. The door, pushed by an unseen hand, began to swing slowly, silently inward. The man who entered the cabin seemed to bring the storm in with him. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with thinning gray hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His clothes were the anonymous uniform of a rural laborer, ill-fitting work pants, a stained flannel shirt, and boots caked with layers of mud and time. But it was his eyes that commanded their terror. They were pale, cold, and unnervingly calm as they moved around the room, taking in the scene not with surprise, but with the cool, calculating appraisal of an owner surveying his property. He looked at the girls, his gaze lingering on each of them for a moment, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his face, revealing stained teeth and dark gaps. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was almost lost in the din of the storm. "Look what the storm brought me." The words, so casual yet so dripping with menace, would echo in Sarah's mind for the next 31 years. He moved with a surprising agility, positioning his body between them and the open doorway before any of them could react to the initial shock. His eyes roamed over them again, as if comparing them to the silent faces on the walls, as if deciding where their pictures would go. "Now, girls," he said, his tone deceptively conversational, "I'm going to need you to stay calm and listen carefully to what I tell you." Kelly found her voice first, her journalistic training providing a fragile shield of professionalism against the terror. "We were just exploring. she said, holding up a camera as if it were a press pass that could grant a safe passage. "We didn't mean to disturb anything. We can just leave and forget we were ever here." The man's smile widened. "Oh, I don't think that's going to work," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You see, you've seen my collection now, my life's work, and I can't have you running back to town, telling stories about what you found up here." He had confirmed it. He was the curator of this museum of horrors. The secret now had a face, and that face was standing before them, holding the key to their cage. The abstract threat that had been a creeping dread just moments before had now solidified into a physical monster. And the full crushing weight of their catastrophic mistake came crashing down upon them. In that fractured moment, as the man's menacing words hung in the air, a primal instinct for survival ignited within Sarah. While his attention was momentarily fixed on Kelly, the perceived leader, the defiant one, Sarah's mind, unclouded by the need to be brave, saw the only way out. Her eyes darted to the boarded-up window at the back of the cabin. It was their only chance, a desperate, impossible chance. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her own terror, she lunged toward it, her fingers clawing at the edge of the damp, rotting plywood. The wood groaned, weakened by years of moisture, and with a final, desperate yank, it gave way, revealing a dark, rain-lashed opening into the maelstrom outside. "Amanda, go!" she screamed, her voice raw. She grabbed her stunned friend and boosted her through the narrow gap. For a heartbeat, Amanda was silhouetted against the stormy gray light. And then she was gone, swallowed by the woods. The sound of splintering wood and Sarah's shout spun the man around, his face contorting into a mask of pure fury. The illusion of the calm, calculating collector vanished, replaced by the raw rage of a predator whose prey was escaping. Sarah tried a package to follow Amanda, scrambling to pull herself through the opening, but she was too slow. A hand, surprisingly strong, clamped around her ankle like a steel trap. He pulled her back into the cabin with such violent force that she crashed to the rough wooden floor, a searing pain shooting through her shoulder as it connected with the planks. That was very foolish. The man snarled, standing over her, his breath a foul cloud of stale tobacco and decay. "Now I'm going to have to hunt down your friend, and that's going to make me very unhappy." It was then that Kelly Thompson provided the first piece of irrefutable evidence in this unholy case. Not evidence for a courtroom, but evidence of a spirit that would not be broken, perhaps inspired by Sarah's desperate act. She did not cower. She did not beg. She acted with a defiant cry. She threw her camera, the symbol of her dreams, at the man's head. The plastic casing cracked against his temple, the impact causing him to stagger back with a grunt of pain. In that same fluid motion, she lunged for the door, but he recovered with a speed that belied his age, a predator's instinct honed over decades of capturing prey. Sarah watched in helpless horror as he caught Kelly by her long, dark hair, yanking her backward so violently that a scream was torn from her throat. The sound was brutally cut short as his arm wrapped around her neck, applying a crushing pressure that made her body go limp. "Stop!" Sarah shrieked, scrambling to her feet despite the agony in her shoulder. "Let her go! Take me instead!" The man's eyes flickered toward her, a flicker of what might have been amusement in their cold depths. "Oh, my dear," he breathed, "you misunderstand. I'm not choosing. I'm collecting both of you." But as he spoke, his grip on Kelly had loosened fractionally. In that infinitesimal moment, her friend's eyes met hers across the dim, terrifying space of the cabin. There was no fear in them now, only a terrifying, resolute clarity. Kelly mouthed a single, silent word: run. Then she did something that would become the cornerstone of Sarah's survival and the genesis of a legend. Instead of trying to break free, Kelly drove her elbow backward into the man's ribs with savage force, making him gasp and release his chokehold. But she did not use that moment to flee. In an act of ultimate, selfless sacrifice, Kelly threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist, not in an embrace, but in a desperate human shackle. She was holding him in place. She was buying time. Go! Kelly screamed, her voice a raw, primal command that cut through the roar of the storm. Get out of here, find Amanda, and get help. Sarah ran. She burst through the open cabin door and into the tempest. The torrential rain, a shocking, cold slap that soaked her to the skin in an instant. She plunged into the woods without looking back, the sound of Kelly's final, terrible screams chasing her, a sound that would be seared into her memory forever, growing fainter and fainter as she crashed through the underbrush, until it was finally consumed by the thunder and the unyielding roar of the Shell Rock River. For 31 years, that act of sacrifice was the only tangible proof of what had happened. Sarah's testimony, delivered in a trauma-induced, disjointed rush to a skeptical Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department, was all there was when she led them back to the area, a place she could identify only by the shape of a fallen oak and the feel of the land. They found nothing. No cabin, no signs of a struggle, no trace that a structure had ever stood there. It was as if the forest had healed itself, closing over the wound and erasing all evidence of the crime. Investigators, though professional, could not hide their creeping doubt. They found Kelly's car, keys still in the ignition, and they combed hundreds of acres with tracking dogs and volunteers. But Amanda Rodriguez and Kelly Thompson had vanished as completely as the cabin itself. Sarah's story, in the absence of corroboration, slowly calcified into a haunting piece of local folklore, the tragic, perhaps embellished, account of a traumatized survivor. The case grew cold, buried under the weight of passing years and a complete lack of physical evidence. Until July 14th, 2024. The irrefutable evidence did not come from a forensic lab or a deathbed confession. It arrived in the form of a middle-aged woman sitting alone at a corner table in a truck stop restaurant, nursing a cup of coffee. 31 years had transformed the vibrant 18-year-old Amanda Rodriguez into a woman in her late 40s. But her existence itself was the one piece of evidence that could never be refuted. Her presence was a bombshell dropped into the heart of a cold case, a living, breathing validation of every word Sarah had spoken. She was thin. Her hands were worn from years of labor she would never describe, and her eyes held a weariness that spoke of entire worlds of suffering. When she and Sarah embraced, it was a collision of two lifetimes, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had been denied for 3 decades. Amanda Rodriguez was alive, and her survival was the first, undeniable exhibit in a case the world had long forgotten. They sat facing each other in the sterile anonymity of a hotel room in Cedar Falls. The floral print bedspread and generic landscape art a bizarrely mundane backdrop for the resurrection that was taking place. The weight of 31 years of unasked questions hung between them. A physical presence in the air-conditioned quiet. Amanda clutched a bottle of water, her knuckles white, her body angled toward the door as if she were a wild creature perpetually ready to flee. Her silence was a wall, and Sarah understood that behind it lay a landscape of horrors so vast that finding the words to describe it was like trying to map an uncharted, lightless continent. "I know you have questions," Amanda began, her voice barely a whisper. "But some answers come with prices that are too high to pay." It was not a confession in the traditional sense, Not the unburdening of a perpetrator, but the tortured testimony of a survivor. And it came in fragments, in fits and starts, over the course of several hours. She never referred to their captor by name, if she had ever learned it. He was only that man, a faceless cipher for an evil so profound it defied identity. He was, she explained, merely one part of a network, a web of people who trafficked young women for reasons that ranged from forced labor to something she would only describe as entertainment. Her story painted a picture not of a lone monster in the woods, but of a systemic, almost corporate, evil, operating invisibly on the margins of society. She and Kelly had been moved frequently, shuttled between locations across the Midwest and the South, never staying in one place long enough to learn the geography, never long enough to form an attachment that could be used as leverage. They worked in agricultural operations, in cleaning services for remote industrial sites, in businesses that existed in the shadows, staffed by ghosts like themselves. The truth of Kelly's fate was delivered with a quiet, devastating finality. She had died 5 years into their captivity. Amanda refused to provide details of the circumstances, the pain still too raw, too sacred to be put into words. She never stopped. Amanda whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her face. She never stopped planning, never stopped believing we could get home. She learned their routines, their weaknesses. She found ways to talk to the others, to create a system. Kelly Thompson, the aspiring journalist, had spent the last 5 years of her life conducting the most important investigation imaginable, documenting her captor's patterns from the inside, her mind, her only notebook. Her planning worked, Amanda said, her voice breaking. It didn't work for her. The network started falling apart after she died, after the things she put in motion started to take effect. She traded her life for mine, and for the possibility that others might eventually be freed, too. The final, horrifying piece of the story was the explanation for Amanda's return, and for her silence. Her escape was not a daring flight to freedom. It was a calculated release. The network, weakened by internal conflicts and unrelated law enforcement pressure, had begun to shed its liabilities. Amanda was allowed to leave, but only after she made a promise, an unthinkable moral bargain. "There are others," she said, her eyes locking with Sarah's, pleading for understanding. "Women and girls who are still there. If I cooperate with any investigation, if I provide details that could lead law enforcement to the locations, those people will be moved or eliminated. They'll disappear forever. The only reason I was allowed to leave was because I promised. I promised I would convince everyone to stop looking. This was the dark unveiling. The story was not about 2 girls who had been lost. It was about countless others who were still captive." And Amanda's freedom had been purchased with her silence, a vow that made her a prisoner of a different kind for the rest of her life. The news of Amanda's return spread through Cedar Falls like a wildfire. A ghost story suddenly, shockingly come to life. The first to arrive at the Rodriguez house was Detective Morrison, now retired, a man whose career had been defined by the case that had refused to die. He was gentler than Sarah expected, his questions soft, his demeanor that of a man who understood he was in the presence of someone who had returned from a war he couldn't imagine. "I just want you to know," Morrison told Amanda, his voice thick with emotion. "We never stopped looking. I'm so sorry we couldn't find you sooner." Amanda thanked him, her gratitude genuine, but her resolve was absolute. She would not answer questions about her captivity. She would not provide information that could lead to a single arrest. When Morrison gently pressed her, speaking of her moral obligation to help others, her response was quiet but unshakable. "I've already saved everyone I can save," she said, her voice devoid of doubt. "And I've already sacrificed everything I can sacrifice. If you try to investigate this, you will destroy the lives of people who have survived things you can't imagine, and you won't rescue anyone." The FBI agents who arrived from Chicago were less understanding. Special Agent Martinez, herself now nearing retirement, saw this as the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to finally bring down a network she had long suspected existed. They spent hours with Amanda, offering witness protection, a new identity, absolute security. They reasoned, they cajoled, they threatened to hold her as a material witness. But they could not break her. She had been forged in a fire they could not comprehend, and her will was made of steel. Her smile was sad, almost pitying, as she gave them her final answer. You can't force someone to remember what they've chosen to forget. The legal repercussions of the greatest crime in Cedar Falls history amounted to nothing. There would be no arrests, no trials, no justice in the conventional sense. The investigation had hit a wall of silence, a wall built of trauma, sacrifice, and a terrible, unbreakable promise. The true societal repercussion, the emotional epicenter of Amanda's return, occurred 2 days later, when Patricia Thompson walked up the familiar steps of the Rodriguez house. She carried a box of documents, a life's work of a different kind. A mother's 31-year investigation into her daughter's disappearance. The meeting was a quiet, devastating affair. Amanda could provide only limited details about Kelly's fate. But she gave Patricia the one thing she had craved for 3 decades' knowledge. "She talked about you constantly," Amanda told her, her voice gentle. "She never forgot how much you loved her. She was the bravest person I've ever known." When Amanda finally delivered a letter Kelly had dictated to her years before, knowing she might not survive, Patricia broke down completely. The knowledge that her daughter had lived for 5 years in captivity was an agony almost harder to bear than the not knowing had been. But within that agony was a small, sacred piece of closure. "She saved you," Patricia said through her tears, clutching the letter to her chest. "My Kelly saved you. That's something. At least that's something she would have been proud of." In that moment, the true verdict was delivered, not in a court of law, but in a grieving mother's living room. There would be no legal justice for Kelly Thompson, but her legacy of courage and sacrifice was now, finally, brought into the light. After a week suspended in the strange, suffocating time warp of her old life, Amanda announced that she was leaving again. The decision landed with the quiet finality of a gravestone being set. She had done what she returned for. She had looked her parents in the eyes. She had honored the memory of her friend, and she had provided a form of closure, however fractured and incomplete, to the woman who had spent a lifetime searching for her lost child. Now, she needed to disappear for a second time, this time on her own terms. The media attention, the constant, probing questions from well-meaning but clueless former classmates, the very air of Cedar Falls, thick with memory and expectation. It was all a cage. "I can't be Amanda Rodriguez anymore," she explained to Sarah during their last conversation, her voice imbued with a calm resolve that was more heartbreaking than any tears. "That girl died in the woods 31 years ago. The person I am now, she needs a different name, a different life, a different story." Sarah wanted to argue, to plead with her to stay, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. But looking into her friend's eyes, she recognized the profound truth of her words. Amanda had not survived to be a living monument to a past tragedy. Her survival demanded a future, and that future could not be built upon the poisoned soil of Cedar Falls. She had earned the right to choose her own definition of freedom. And if that freedom meant erasure, then Sarah would be the last one to stand in her way. And so, Amanda's second disappearance was as complete as her first had been involuntary. She left no forwarding address, no phone number, no trace of where she might be going. She simply walked away, dissolving back into the vast, anonymous landscape of America, leaving behind a family that had found and lost her all over again in the space of a single week. The brief, miraculous reunion proved to be a weight the Rodriguez family structure could no longer bear. For Carlos Rodriguez, seeing his daughter alive had been the fulfillment of a prayer he had whispered every night for 3 decades. But seeing her leave again, knowing he could not follow, broke something deep within him. The hope that had been his life's fuel was finally extinguished, and with it, the will that had sustained his failing heart. He passed away in his sleep 18 months later, a man who had finally been granted his miracle, only to find it was not his to keep. Maria's decline was quieter, a slow retreat into the fog of dementia. In a way, it was a mercy. Her mind gently erased the traumatic return, smoothing over the jagged edges of reality until she was left with a simpler, kinder past. In her final days at a memory care facility, she would often speak of Amanda as if she were still 18, just away at college, due to be home soon for the holidays. The shrine in her daughter's bedroom remained, but its meaning had shifted from a place of desperate hope to one of placid, untroubled memory. For Sarah, the redefinition was internal, a seismic shift in the landscape of her soul. Amanda's return had lifted the crushing burden of survivor's guilt that had shaped her entire adult life. She finally understood that her escape that day had not been an act of abandonment, but the first, necessary link in a chain of events that had ultimately led to her friend's survival. But freedom from one prison only revealed the walls of another. The guilt was replaced by a new, more complex weight, the burden of knowledge. She was now the co-keeper of Amanda's terrible secret, a silent partner in a pact that protected the lives of unknown victims at the cost of justice. The nightmares of Kelly's screams were replaced by new ones haunting. Abstract dreams of faceless women trapped in darkness. Women she could never help. Women whose existence she could never acknowledge. Her life was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had to conceal. The years that followed saw the story of the Cedar Falls disappearances slowly fade from public consciousness. Its final, shocking chapter left unwritten, but the legacy of that day at the river continued to ripple outward, shaping lives in ways both public and private. Patricia Thompson, having received the final, heartbreaking truth about her daughter, channeled her immeasurable grief into a fierce, new purpose. She used the insurance money from Kelly's presumed death to establish the Thompson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing financial and emotional support to the families of missing persons. She never left Cedar Falls, choosing instead to become a formidable advocate, a figure of strength and solace for other parents forced to navigate the special kind of hell she had endured. Her personal tragedy was alchemized into a public legacy of compassion, ensuring that Kelly's name would be associated not with victimhood, but with help and hope. She died of cancer in 2029, leaving behind an institution that would continue her daughter's work of fighting for those the world had forgotten. Detective Morrison, in his retirement, wrote a book about the unsolved cases that had haunted his career, dedicating an entire chapter to the Cedar Falls mystery. He honored his unspoken promise to Amanda, never revealing the details of her return or the moral complexities that kept the case officially open but functionally closed. Instead, he used the story as a somber meditation on the limits of law enforcement and the complex, often contradictory. Nature of justice, the legend of the abandoned cabin. Meanwhile, persisted. Multiple new searches of the area were conducted over the years, employing ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technologies that hadn't existed in 1993. They found nothing. No foundations, no debris, no anomalous soil samples. The structure that Sarah and Amanda had described with unwavering consistency remained a ghost. Its complete and total disappearance a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the network that had operated it. The lingering secret of that network remained the story's most chilling aspect. Had it dissolved, as Amanda suggested, or had it simply adapted, evolving to avoid detection in a more technologically advanced world? The other faces in the photographs on the cabin wall remained nameless, their fates unknown, their stories lost to the silence. Then, in 2030, 37 years after that terrible day, a small package arrived at Sarah's home. There was no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph, printed on glossy paper. It showed two women, standing on a wide, sandy beach, their faces turned away from the camera, toward the vast, blue expanse of the ocean. One of the women was unmistakably Amanda. She was in her mid-50s now, but she looked healthier, more at peace than she had during her brief, haunted return to Iowa. The other woman was a stranger, but the easy way she stood beside Amanda, their shoulders almost touching, suggested a deep and comfortable intimacy. On the back of the photograph, in a familiar, cursive handwriting, were a few simple words: "Some of us found our way to happiness. Thank you for helping make that possible." A single initial followed A. Sarah kept the photograph on her desk, a quiet, daily reminder that survival takes many forms, and that closure is not a destination, but a journey. She never tried to trace its origin. She understood that respecting her friend's hard-won anonymity was the final, most profound act of loyalty she could offer. The official story of the three friends who went to the Shell Rock River ended with a mystery. But the real story, the human story, ended with the small act of grace, a message from a life reclaimed, a confirmation that even after the deepest darkness, light could find a way to return. In the end, what is the true meaning of justice? Is it the punishment of the guilty, served in a court of law, a neat closing of a police file? Or is it something more complex, more human? Is it the preservation of the living? Even at the cost of vengeance for the dead, Amanda Rodriguez made an impossible choice, sacrificing the world's definition of justice for a more immediate, more desperate form of salvation. Her silence was not an act of cowardice, but an act of profound, agonizing courage, a promise sealed in trauma, a shield for those who remained in the shadows. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that sometimes the pursuit of truth can be a destructive force, and that silence, in its own terrible way, can be a form of love. The tragedy that occurred in Cedar Falls has become a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore whispered to teenagers who venture too close to the river's edge. But to call it folklore is to diminish its truth. It is not a story. It is a memory, a reality, a scar on the land and on the lives of those who were touched by it. Sarah Chen Kim continues her quiet life, a guardian of secrets she can never share, and a witness to a courage she can never fully describe. Somewhere in America, a woman who was once called Amanda Rodriguez lives under a new name, her piece purchased at an unimaginable price, and in a cemetery in Cedar Falls. Kelly Thompson's headstone bears a date that marks only the beginning of her life, not the end of her impact. Her grave stands as a silent monument to the idea that some sacrifices are too sacred to be measured by time, and that the greatest acts of heroism often happen in secret, witnessed only by the lives they save. The mystery of what happened at Shell Rock River will never be officially solved, but perhaps resolution was never the point. The story of the three friends is not really about disappearance at all. It is about presence, the enduring presence of a love that transcends death, the weight of promises that define a life, and the chilling, ever-present reality that the darkest corners of history are not in the distant past, but are often hidden in the quiet, sunlit places we call home.